The goal of ballistic type training is to really focus on velocity of movement. And so, what we're generally looking at here from a modality perspective is going to be jumps and medicine ball exercises. So, we're looking at very light loads. When it comes to jumps, we're looking at using body weight. Obviously, if we start to add external load, then we're going to slow down the speed of movement and we're actually addressing a different part of the force velocity curve. From a medicine ball perspective, we're looking at anywhere from probably 2 to 10 pounds, depending on the movement and depending on the abilities of the client in question. But the ultimate goal, then, of course, of our ballistic type training is to have a shift in this force time relationship to the left hand side. In this example, we're seeing the dashed line is the post training result. The solid line is pre training. So, as a result of spending some time on developing ballistic abilities, the person is improving their rate of force production, and in a certain restricted time frame, we are seeing greater force application. From a sets and reps perspective, we're looking at, again, both jumps and medicine ball type exercises. From a reps perspective, we are looking at about 5 being optimal, up to 10 being acceptable. So it's quite common. You'll see anywhere from 3 to 10 repetitions programmed. Anything beyond 10 repetitions, we're really getting out of the purpose of ballistic type training and the purpose of jumps, which of course is explosiveness, and we're really just getting a metabolic effect. From a reps per session perspective, so the session volume is anywhere from about 25 to 50. The total number of reps per week, so the weekly volume is anywhere from 100 to 150. The loads we know are light, so body weight or light implements when it comes to the medicine balls itself. Rest interval is suggested to be 2 minutes. And this is the kind of textbook rest interval to make sure we have complete neuromuscular restoration so that every repetition is as explosive as possible. However, we have to think about the reality of this. Do we really need a full 2 minutes to recover from a set of 5 medicine ball throws? Now, this also brings us to the point of logistics. There's a lot of things to be done in a comprehensive program, and so maybe we don't have time to sit there and rest passively for 2 full minutes. So it's quite common to pair ballistic exercises, specifically pairing jumps with med ball. So we might do a box jump, and then while we're recovering from the box jump, walk over to the med ball wall, do our explosive med ball, and then go back and forth. And this kind of takes care of that suggested rest interval. We do see great variation in the reps per session and in the reps per week, but that's because it really depends on the frequency of training, the movement difficulty, and training age, etc. So we're going to go into a little bit of volume distribution examples. We'd suggested that anywhere from 5 to 10 reps is common and accepted. And once you start getting over 10 repetitions, we're really not focusing so much on power anymore, as much as just inducing a lot of systemic fatigue. So if we take a look at jump height versus number of repetitions here, obviously we are seeing preservation of power over our first 5 repetitions, and so that's great. From a specificity perspective, if I want to develop peak ballistic abilities, I want to make sure that every repetition is being performed with peak ballistic abilities. Then we take a look at what happens when we transition from 5 to 10 repetitions. And what we notice is that we're still able to preserve peak power fairly well. We're starting to dip below most likely 80% of our peak power. And then, of course, as we extend the set towards 15, 20, 30 repetitions, etc., we're going to see a significant drop off in power and peak jump height, and a significant increase in the respiration rate, heart rate, and all of those types of things, which brings us to that metabolic effect. Jump training is often referred to as plyometrics, but technically, a plyometric is any movement that uses the stretch shortening cycle. So we could be doing upper body med ball stuff, right? Which uses the stretch shortening cycle, but people don't call medicine ball work plyometric. We also have to understand that not all jumps use the stretch shortening cycle. So technically, not all jumps are plyometrics. This is all a semantics type thing. And I'm okay if people are just using the terms interchangeably, saying, hey, what are you going to do for plyos today? And I know they're referring to jumps. Now, the purpose, of course, of jump training is going to be lower body explosiveness and force absorption. All too often in our field, we focus so much on the actual concentric action of a jump that we forget that force absorption is a hugely important factor for performance and injury prevention. That's why we need to appreciate the 2 phases of a jump. Obviously, the takeoff, which trains explosiveness, rate of force development. We could use the stretch shortening cycle or not to help us to propel off the ground. But then we always will have this landing part, which is working on force absorption. This is why in this particular little clip, I'm emphasizing holding the landing position. So you can see a couple repetitions being performed, springing off the ground using that stretch shortening cycle, and then landing, holding the position, owning that position. When looking at our takeoff options, we have to decide, do we want to be using the stretch shortening cycle in our jumps or not? And we need to appreciate that there are going to be different training adaptations depending on whether or not we allow it to be used. So let's take a look on the left-hand side first. And this is where we are using the stretch shortening cycle. So we are allowing that eccentric loading before we take off of the ground. So this is obviously going to be conducive to stimulating adaptations for the stretch shortening cycle. You become more efficient, more effective, greater power outputs when you get the opportunity to use the stretch shortening cycle. If we're going to do this for a singular repetition, it's often referred to as reactive strength. And in this context, the repetitions would be performed discontinuously. And you can see an example of discontinuous here. This might be a set of 5, but the person is dipping, going, and then holding their landing, then they'll repeat the movement. As opposed to when we use the stretch shortening cycle continuously. And this is working on more of what we call elastic strength, that just ability to bounce repeatedly off of the ground. And that's what you're seeing in this one. Okay, springing off of the floor. And then finally, these are referred to as counter movement jumps. When you use the stretch shortening cycle, you are performing a counter movement. That is the movement that starts the action, whereas you drop down, counters the end of the movement, which is where you explode off of the ground. So that's where the term counter movement comes from. So when we program a counter movement, we have to understand that is our way of saying, yep, use the stretch shortening cycle. Now, what happens if we don't use the stretch shortening cycle? Well, we're going to stimulate adaptations in rate of force development independent of the stretch shortening cycle. So we're working on someone's own concentric explosiveness without using stored energy and the stretch reflex, etc. This is often termed starting strength or accelerative strength, and this would be programmed by using a non-counter movement. All right, so we're not allowing the counter movement. In other words, we're not allowing the stretch shortening cycle. And you can see an example here. In this example, the person pauses before they actually leave the ground. When it comes to jump training, much like medicine ball programming, we do have to be mindful of the components that go into exercise selection. When it comes to jumps, we have to be mindful of the initiation, the direction. Is there going to be a barrier involved or not? And then what movement are we actually wanting? So let's look at initiation. You can have a counter movement, which again is using the stretch shortening cycle. We could have a non-counter movement where we are avoiding the stretch shortening cycle completely. We could have double contact, which is a little bit of a bounce before somebody goes. And then we could also have a depth or drop type of jump. From a direction perspective, we can have vertical movements, forward movements, horizontal, lateral, medial, diagonal, and rotational. If we're going to use a barrier or some type of external implement, we might have boxes or hurdles. And then from a movement, we can have either jumps, hops, bounds, or what's not in here, which is also popular, is going to be skips. So when we are programming, we have to account for all of these things. So here's some examples. We have a counter movement jump, or we have a counter movement box jump. Now you'll notice vertical is assumed. So if we ever see a program where it doesn't say counter movement vertical jump or something like that, if we don't have the direction defined, it's assumed to be vertical. However, for everything else, we have to keep that direction in there, and it's a good practice, just keep it in there all the time. But here's another example then. There's our non-counter movement, lateral hurdle hop. So you can see that we have our initiation under control, we have our direction under control, we have our movement type, and we've accounted for the fact that there's an implement being used as well. As a reminder then, from ballistic abilities, whether it's med ball stuff or jumps, we're still looking at anywhere from 5 to 10 repetitions. Our volume is anywhere 25 to 50 per session with a weekly volume of 100 to 150. Again, jumps are often paired with medicine ball things. Just as with medicine ball stuff, we had ranges suggested for session volume and of course for weekly volume. So let's look at what that might look like from a 2, 3, 4, 5 session per week program. Again, if we're on a 2-day program, we just see lower weekly volumes, but that is one of the downsides of an infrequent training program. Once we get up into 3, 4, and 5 sessions per week, we're seeing more reasonable numbers that allow us to hit the weekly volume recommendations. I'm not going to break down each of these numbers because it's literally the same slide that we used for medicine ball. But I do want to draw your attention to the 4-day program that now has different emphases on different days. So Monday, for example, we have our linear emphasis, and on Tuesday we have our lateral emphasis. Now this principle or concept could be transferred back into a 3-day program where we might have a linear emphasis on Monday, we might have our lateral emphasis Wednesday, we'll be back to linear on Friday, and then the next week, Monday, it's now time for lateral. So it's important to understand what we're referring to here, and this is really the movement direction. So linear type things are going to be vertical, they're going to be forward, and our lateral type things are going to involve our lateral movements, our medial movements, our diagonal movements, etc. So it is just a way to make sure that we are addressing movements from both a linear and lateral perspective and having balance throughout the week. Now we get to our examples of what 30 total jumps might look like. 2 scenarios, straight sets, and of course, paired sets. When it comes to our straight sets here, then we have our non-counter movement box jump is first. So obviously one of the challenges to make sure we understand how this needs to be implemented. It is non-counter movement, so that means there is no stretch shortening cycle being used. It is a jump, which is a 2-foot takeoff, 2-foot landing, and we're using a box. Remember, we have not put V here because that's going to be assumed. 3 sets of 5 repetitions. Notice, instead of load in this column of my programming template, I've now put intensity. You could leave it as load. You don't need to create a new template just for this section of your program, but understand that we do probably want to make note of the intensity. You're working with different clients throughout the day. Some people might be using an 18-inch box, some might be using 24 inches, some might be using 12, etc. Effort level, again, this needs to be maximum, right? It's ballistic in nature. You're jumping as high as humanly possible and then landing on that 18-inch box. And then the rest interval, again, we've already talked about it from a logistical perspective. Can you really afford to sit there for 2 minutes? Moving on to the more common and time-efficient way to program this stuff is going to be pairing with medicine ball work. So this is a copy and paste from the medicine ball slides, and we have the med ball paired with our jump and plyo. I have this arrow here to show you it doesn't matter which goes first. You could do your jump first and then go to your med ball. Considerations for jump intensity or jump progressions are on the left-hand side here. Specifically, we want to be mindful of the eccentric demands or ground reaction forces involved in the movement, the degree of stretch shortening cycle utilization, and then stability. The simplest way to look at it is things that don't involve the stretch shortening cycle are easier, right? They're more remedial than things that do involve the stretch shortening cycle. Things that are bilateral are more remedial than unilateral. So let's look at this from a specific standpoint here. Eccentric demands or ground reaction forces. Obviously, we have to be mindful that things that involve a large eccentric demand or a lot of ground reaction forces are going to take more strength and are going to be more difficult to ensure that we have a short amortization phase. Remember, we're always looking at the eccentric action, putting on the brakes and reversing that into the concentric phase as quickly as possible. And so high eccentric demands, yeah, we'll store more energy, but we run the risk of a prolonged coupling time or transition time. Bilateral things are going to be progressed towards unilateral. When we're using a box, we progress to then not using a box, which then gets progressed to a depth type of action. When we're looking at the stretch shortening cycle, movements that involve the SSC are more intense than those that do not involve the SSC. So this means that we will go from non-counter movement things towards counter movement things. tied kind of to the eccentric demands are going to be the fact that we would start by jumping to a box, then we would progress to landing at the same level that we take off, then we would progress to landing at a level below takeoff. This is just a different perspective on this progression, which is box, ground-based, and then depth. If we're looking at contact types, we would be starting with discontinuous things, right? We would be looking at introducing a counter movement. We would get a little bit more elastic by allowing a double contact and then progressing to continuous true plyometrics, which is rep after rep after rep after rep. Finally, we want to be mindful of stability. This is the surface area of the foot that is available to provide stability upon landing. And in essence, this has to oppose the momentum of the movement. So we're looking at vertical things being quite simple because there's no displacement forward or back. Then we're looking at forward. Forward then gets progressed to diagonal, which is progressed to lateral, then progressed to medial, finally rotational. Now, the delineation between lateral and medial is simply due to the joint structure and our ability to be stable when we hop laterally as opposed to hopping medially. Now we're going to look at 4 different movements that have different eccentric requirements, or said a different way, there are different ground reaction force requirements. The first one, if we take a look on the top left here, is our non-counter movement box jump. So we have to appreciate that this is basically a jump that starts from a static squat position. We're not allowing the stretch shortening cycle. Client jumps up, and then in order to reduce the eccentric demands of the movement or reduce the ground reaction forces involved, we have the person drop to a box. Now, the progression of this is going to be allowing them to drop all the way to the floor. So there's going to be greater eccentric demands, ground reaction forces, etc. Also appreciate the fact that this is a counter movement jump, meaning they're allowed to use the stretch shortening cycle. They will dip down and then they will explode up and then have to stick their landing. The extension of this, of course, is going to be a depth jump where we have even greater eccentric requirements or ground reaction forces because the body is now being accelerated towards the ground. So we're going to need a lot of strength to put on the brakes here and quickly reverse that action. And then, of course, we're coming all the way back to the ground again. So another scenario with high ground reaction forces upon the landing. And then finally, we look at hurdle hops, for example. And so a hop, now all of this eccentric stuff needs to be handled by a single limb. I wanted to show a specific example of a jump progression over 4 phases, 12 weeks. Each phase is 3 weeks. This is a concept application. So we're not memorizing these timeframes exactly, but it's the principles, much like our entire field is. And so once we understand the principles of progression, we can apply that to a multitude of situations. Let's take a look at phase number 1 first. And the focus of phase number 1 is stability and eccentric strength. So we're going to be using things that are discontinuous. We will have some counter movement and non-counter movement in there, but boxes will be used. Again, the boxes, the purpose is to reduce the eccentric demands of the movement. If we have hurdles or other obstacles involved, that are going to be low. Phase number 2, then, the focus is going to shift to adding in the effect of gravity. So we're trying to increase that eccentric challenge. They're still going to be discontinuous with a mixture of counter movement and non-counter movement, but this time we will be taking the boxes away so the people will be controlling the eccentric portion as their body falls completely to the floor. And then if we are going to use obstacles, they're going to be a little bit higher because that's going to allow people to jump higher and then have an increased eccentric demand. Anywhere from 6 to 30 inches. This is very movement specific and individual specific as well. Then we move on to phase number 3, where we're just trying to increase stretch shortening cycle utilization to introduce more elasticity. And generally, this will be done via double contact type movements. Still, most focus now is going to be on counter movement. Finally, our final phase is going to be what we would refer to often as true plyometrics. Movements that are now continuous in nature, where the person is just springing from rep to rep to rep to rep. The previous example was a kind of zoomed out potential progression. Now I want to give 2 specific progression examples, one for hops and one for jumps. Basically, all we're doing is using the progression principles to specific movement types. One, let's go with the jumps. First thing we would be introducing is going to be a drop catch or a snap down or a drop squat, depending what we want to call it. This is where we are working on controlling our eccentric actions. We will go a non-counter movement box jump, progress to adding some elasticity with counter movements. Then we would take the box away. So we'd be in a vertical jump scenario. We'd be into a discontinuous situation, getting into some double contact over hurdles to make it more elastic, finally progressing to true plyometrics continuous counter movement jumps. If we look at the hop progression, you'll notice it is very, very similar from a principle standpoint. We're going to start with our unilateral drop catch, but we have two different intermediate steps here. We can start to work on taking off on a single leg, but landing on two. Obviously, one of the bigger challenges to single leg work is controlling those eccentric forces on a single limb. So this allows us to start introducing single leg explosiveness, but not have that large eccentric component put onto one leg. Then slowly over time, we're moving into the boxes. Then we're getting rid of the boxes. We are adding some elasticity and finally ending with true plyometrics where we're bouncing from rep to rep. So we would be using the same progression model once we start to look at bounds or lateral movements, etc. In terms of box jumps, one of the questions that comes up quite frequently is how do you know what the optimal height is? And it's fairly simple. We just want to pick a box where the client can achieve appropriate joint positions upon landing. We have two examples here. This is a 36-inch box and this is a 48-inch box. Now, instantly you would think, well, the 48-inch box takes more power, it's more impressive and all of those things. But if you notice the center of mass of the individual, or if we just looked at the top of their head, for example, it went the same distance in both jumps. The only difference we see in these two jumps is the degree of hip flexion and knee flexion required at the landing, right? So really this shows us that, okay, good, you got onto the 48-inch box because you were able to quickly get your knees up to your chest and stick the landing, not because you exerted any more power than you did on your 36-inch box. So that's a real simple rule. We just want to make sure that the client lands at the appropriate joint angles for almost any particular jump, hop, or bound when we're using our box. There seems to be a lot of variability in how people go about performing their box jumps. Let's take a look at the middle example first. First problem, of course, is we have knees to chest. So I think it would be better to have a lower box. Also, if the client has to rapidly bring their knees to their chest just to stick the box jump, there's always the chance that they clip their toe or something like that on the top of the blocks and have some type of accident. Also, this person is defeating the purpose of using a box. Remember, the purpose of using the box technically was to reduce the eccentric demands of the movement, but by jumping to the box and then jumping off of the box, you have reintroduced the eccentric component of the movement. Now let's take a look at this one. In this one, it's kind of a hybrid. I'm not sure if it's just a box jump, but then it becomes a depth jump because they jump off of the box and back up. But also, I don't like that they're not sticking the landing. There are two components to a jump, takeoff and landing. Both are important, force production and force absorption. And so this person is simply missing out on the force absorption portion. So what it should look like is something like this. That's not an impressively high box, but that's okay because we know the purpose of the box was to just reduce the eccentric demands a little bit. So we're seeing a non-counter movement box jump here. The person is holding the position, taking off, landing, holding the landing, and stepping off of the box. There are two other terms that are often used when describing plyometric type exercises from a progression standpoint, and that is going to be intensive movements versus extensive movements. However, this is a limiting programming term to say we're going to do intensive stuff today and extensive tomorrow. Obviously, extremely limiting because we are not getting into contact type, utilization of the stretch shortening cycle and stuff like that. But it was popularized by a great instrumental strength coach, Dr. Yuri Verkhoshansky. So what are we referring to from an intensive standpoint is things that are high impact. There's a high neural demand. These are going to be done for lower volume then. They're mostly vertical. And sometimes people will actually use this term to describe intent. So we want maximum height or maximum distance in these intensive movements. The other term associated here is going to be extensive. These are going to be things that are lower impact and therefore lower neural demand. We could get away with higher volumes. They're mostly locomotive in nature. So instead of jumping as high as you possibly can vertically, you might be doing forward jumps over a hurdle, for example. Now, some, again, as we said, will use this in terms of intent. And so this one is where the focus is more on repeated efforts with minimum ground contact time. However, it is not recommended to use the terms intensive or extensive from a programming perspective because, again, ultimately, it's just pretty limiting. Here's yet another practical example, and this is the 4-day example where we have 1 day dedicated to more linear type movements and 1 day dedicated towards more lateral type movements. So there's day 1 linear and day 2 being lateral. The difference between beginners and advanced clients when it comes to jumps or plyometrics really just is in exercise selection. The volume or the dose, right, that we're looking at is still going to be about, again, kind of 25 to 50 reps per session or 100 to 150 per week. But we're just choosing movements that are more appropriate based on the client's training age. So we're seeing non-counter movement things that are jumps, for example. They're going to be discontinuous. But over here, someone who's more advanced, we're going to be using continuous stuff. And now we're using bounds, so single leg type of things, hops, single leg type of things.